So, Johann, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we walk into the future, can you please tell us a little bit about your background? Where did you grow up?
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I usually don't like lots of attention on myself, so let's see how this goes. I grew up in a town called George in the Garden Route of South Africa, right down in the center of the south side of South Africa. So beautiful town.
Okay.
Um, Went to school there until my matric year. And yeah, it's a beautiful town caught between the mountains and the sea. Absolutely fantastic.
And Johann, can you tell us what was your dream career when you grew up?
Well, I didn't really know until high school. So I thought about becoming a doctor or an attorney. I thought law might be very interesting. But then when I walked into Standard 6 or today's Grade 8 um, in high school, they offered a subject called economics. And I thought, hang on, this sounds interesting. Now, this was before the days of Google, so this was in 1976, Nick, so some
Right.
time ago. Um, and I thought this is interesting, and I went to the library and I did some reading, and I thought, hang on, let's try this. And I chose that as one of my optional subjects in high school, and I absolutely loved it. And from Standard 6, 1976 onwards, I wanted to become an economist. I knew that was my role that I would like to become. And as my wife always says, I'm one of the lucky ones who knew from early days and still love the same career, still love the same subject. Never once did I think I should have become that lawyer. This isn't for me. Every time there's something new happening in the economics field, I absolutely love it. So I'm very lucky indeed.
So tell us, Johann, with all the technology available today, all the data available, has it become harder or easier to predict the future of the economy?
It's always hard. It's always hard to predict. Because economics is also not an exact science. So you might think things move in this direction, and then actually underlying, because there's always data lags and data revisions, you're never quite sure. So it's always a question of you're going to be wrong in terms of the numbers you forecast. So you try to get the direction right in terms of, let's say, inflation. Is it going to go up over the next few years, or is it going to go down? Direction is far more important than the exact number on a certain date in time.
Right. And going back to your early days, Johann, can you tell us who inspired you?
Well, those were the days when, actually in 1976, when I listened on radio still to my first budget. So since 1976, I've listened to every single budget in South Africa. Watched in later years, some of the early years, I read the Hansard documents from Parliament, but ministers of finance, they were my early inspirations in terms of because I was just so interested in the economics field, and budget was the sort of the transparent one to watch. And then in later years, I watched central bank governors. I remember one of the ministers of finance was Owen Horwood in South Africa, and one of the great central bank governors, Dr. Chris Stals. Um, and those were the type of people that I looked up to in terms of their pronouncements of the economy. So yeah, a very long time ago, but the sort of officialdom were the starts of who I looked up to in terms of the economics field.
Right. Now, I believe today South Africa is hosting, Cape Town is hosting the G20 finance ministers and governors. So what are your expectations from G20, from South Africa's hosting of the G20 this year?
Oh, I'm not really very optimistic in terms of the outcomes of all the meetings this year. We're starting off with these ones, and later in the year, the heads of state. All very noble ideals that would probably, in the longer term, have some impact in terms of the future of the economy, the future of the country, in terms of climate change and economic policies, etc. I'm not very optimistic that there'll be any short-term benefit from these. Well, essentially, they talk shops. I think that's also important. I don't mean to put that as not important. They're important, but there's lots of ideals that takes a long time to come to fruition. And I think the most important benefit for South Africa out of this is a bigger standing in the world in terms of diplomacy, in a bigger standing in terms of economic policy making. It also puts a little bit of a pressure on South Africa in terms of making the right policies, being seen to be doing the right thing in terms of our own domestic policies, where for a long time we've had very weak economic growth with all the social ills that come from that. That we should be seen to do the right thing in terms of getting better growth and doing something about poverty and unemployment, etc. So it's great goals, but it takes a while to work its way through into the system. And in the short term, I think the benefit is more in terms of our standing in the world. We're hosting the G20. We're participating in these global talk shops. We're showing ourselves to be up there with the rest.
Right. Now, going back to your leadership career, Johann, today you are the group chief economist for Old Mutual, South Africa's, and probably the continent's biggest financial institution. Looking back over your career, was there a turning point or maybe a couple of turning points?
I suspect that there's always, well, potentially lots for all of us. I started off my career by working at the South African Reserve Bank. I was fortunate to have a study bursary from them, paid for my studies, so I worked there. I was a lecturer at Stellenbosch University for a while. I worked in the private sector in terms of Trust Bank, one of the constituent banks of today's ABSA. And through those various jobs, before I joined Old Mutual even, you get a different take on the economy all the time in terms of Reserve Bank, more policy making input, in terms of the direction of economic research, in terms of academics, somewhat different as well. And banking sector, very strong focus on the interest rate environment in a bank. And then at Old Mutual, where I've worked the bulk of my career in the investment division, and that's slightly a different take as well. But I've always wondered about going back to being a lecturer at varsity. I love that environment, but practical economics, especially in terms of the investment environment, removed from academics to a large extent, the base is always there, but in terms of the need to look forward, because we invest for the medium to longer term. The short term stuff is important in terms of how it informs the longer term view, what is going to happen in the economy, but the longer term perspective is always important because, as I say, we invest our clients' money not for today or tomorrow or next month, but for 3 to 5 years plus. The longer term in terms of investment is hugely important in terms of those investment returns. So there were obviously all those turning points in terms of coming from central bank to academia to a bank and then to an investment division. And then, of course, the turning point came 5 years or so ago when I became Old Mutual Investments chief economist. And then it's a different role than just the guy at the bottom gathering the data, drawing up the graphs. But still, I still love that part and I still do that part because that's hugely important in terms of keeping updated on what is happening. For instance, this morning before we started this conversation, inflation for January was released in South Africa, and after more than 35 years of watching inflation numbers, it's still interesting. That's amazing. But yeah, all the turning points and becoming the chief economist of Old Mutual, for instance, that's again a slightly different environment than in the investment division, where you closely look at just the impact of the economy on investments and what it means for how portfolio managers invest monies, whether it's equities or bonds or cash, and whether it's in South Africa or emerging markets or developed economies, all those type of issues that impacts not only the economy, but then investments. And in terms of a broader role, then you have to look bigger, more strategic type thinking, lots of client support, meaning you have to disseminate your research and present that to all the stakeholders of the company. And they are broad based and many in terms of various areas of interest in economics.
So, Johann, can you tell us what is driving you today? What is motivating you? What is energizing you every single day?
Well, always to do better, because the difficulty, as I said earlier, with economics, it's not an exact science. So you don't always get things right. And an important part of the job is just checking on where you make mistakes and where have you made mistakes and why. Sometimes it's easy because there was an explanation. For example, data was revised away totally, so that's why your forecast was wrong for the year or last year or whenever. And then other times you were just not taking into account all the different aspects that influenced a certain forecast or decision. So always the need to do better. So in terms of scenario planning, for instance, which direction is the SA economy going to go? And in terms of that, it's hugely important, again, to have that longer term vision. And I suppose a huge part of my job, at least, is to guide my stakeholders through all the noise out there. And there's lots of noise. I would get a phone call saying the rand exchange rate weakened by 10 cents to the US dollar yesterday. Usually that's nothing. Sometimes that is the start of a trend, but mostly it's just noise. If we see social media exploding with lots of issues at the moment, for instance, the potential that South Africa might be thrown out of AGOA, the trade agreement that Africa has with the US. Yes, it's got a huge sentimental impact, perhaps, but in actual direct impact on the economy, it's far less than what most people anticipate, because only 2% of South Africa's exports are subject to the AGOA agreement. So it's that guidance that an economist needs to do in terms of guiding internally and externally my clients. This is noise. Don't be too concerned. Or this is noise that I'm watching closely because it might become a trend. Or these are the actual underlying trends that we need to be watching. And of course, in that process, I cannot ignore anything because you have to keep an eye on these things. But guiding people through the noise, and sometimes that's not easy. Sometimes that takes time.
Now, Johann, looking into the future, and I know it's a big question, but what does the future of leadership mean to you?
Yeah, that's perhaps not such an easy one. I think if any leader is guided by the principles of respect and communication, I think those two are, for me at least, hugely important and hang very closely together. Any leader should have respect for the people around him or her, and well, respect goes both ways, up and down the chain, but respect is a huge one in terms of just making sure everybody's happy in the role that they have. It also makes a big difference if everybody's happy in their career path, and sometimes that's not always the case. I'm lucky. People around me are also fortunate that I can see they love their jobs. And then communication, open, transparent, free communication flows, again, up and down the chain. that people should be feeling respected so that they can be open to communicate without any fear of that communication being detrimental to their future. And I think there's obviously lots of other areas, but for me personally, that's the most important ones: respect and communication. If you follow just the broad rules around those two, I think you should be able to cover most bases in terms of a leadership role or a mentee role, etc.
Right. Now, Johann, these are challenging times as the world is stumbling from one crisis into the next. What is your advice for future leaders in terms of challenges? What are some challenges they should expect to encounter in their career and hopefully overcome?
Yeah, that's sometimes difficult because the older we get, the more resistant we tend to be in terms of change. We hesitant to accept change. And for instance, in this era of artificial intelligence, we should always be flexible. We should be open to new developments. And I think that's hugely important for any leader, for any role, for any employee in any job. Be flexible. Be open to change. Change is not always easy, but change is necessary. and if we just open to that, we're able to ask the right questions. We're able to get people around us to inform us of the stuff that we're not aware of. So it's that humility as well that we need to accept. We cannot know everything. We're learning something new every day. We should be open to that.
Right. Now, Johann, as a lecturer to many future leaders, if you were to design a curriculum for future leaders, what are maybe one or two key skills you would want to factor in and maybe teach?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because it can be very broad and it can be very narrow. I think from a broader sense is inquisitiveness. You must be inquisitive. You must be willing to dig into data, dig into this question, dig into that question. That is hugely important, I think, to be inquisitive. But also, I mentioned or used the word humility before. Accept that you don't know everything. Gather information, gather people around you that's willing to inform you. And all of that, I think, comes back to communication again, that key word I used before. So I think inquisitiveness, willingness to accept that you don't know everything, willingness to accept that there are many people around us that will know more than us in other fields. Gather that information. Ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Ask.
Right. Now, Johann, as a mentor to many future leaders, can you maybe share a success story or two without naming names when you mentored an upcoming leader and that person took your advice to heart?
Yeah, there's a couple of very strong budding economists out there that has come through over the past few years that and again that comes down to they've been inquisitive. They've been willing to ask the questions, and I to some extent find that the younger generations are far more willing to ask, being open to potential embarrassment even, because even though I say no such thing as a stupid question, some people are hesitant because they think what they're asking is going to be seen as stupid. I never see that. So some of these budding young students who became economists, who became chief economists at other institutions and also in the financial sector. So I view that as very exciting, and I'm not going to take credit for helping them to get there, but in terms of contact, and I think one of the most important things there is, again, that accept that people are going to have different views. And
Right.
when I speak to an audience, I always say, I don't mind if you don't agree. I don't mind if you have a huge argument with me about something. And through that, we both learn. If we have different opinions, but we're willing to be open to discuss that and willing to accept the fact that, well, both of us might be wrong in this argument. There might be a third argument that's the correct one and we're missing something. But through that, and again, through communication, through exchanging views and through talking about them, I've seen many of these budding economists became very successful in their careers because they've been willing to ask the questions, being willing to discuss the issues, very open to potentially being wrong, and then discussing this. And I think that's important.
And Johann, looking back over your own leadership career, are there any role models of leadership who you have encountered and maybe worked with who you feel future leaders could learn from?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's been a number of those over the years. I mentioned Dr. Chris Stolz. When I worked at the Reserve Bank, for instance, he was the governor. In terms of his thinking around economics, he's also view that ignore the small stuff unless they become bigger issues, but look at the bigger picture. And I think step back a little bit and see the bigger picture rather than focusing on the small stuff. And then, of course, Old Mutual's own chairman, Trevor Manuel, who used to be Minister of Finance, and in my view, the best Minister of Finance we've had in democratic South Africa, in terms of that ability to go and delve into the nitty-gritty detail to get to the bottom of a problem. And then step back and see what is the bigger picture. So the combination of those, and I think those are the two that I wanted to mention in terms of the absolute focus on the job at hand.
Now, Johann, how can our listeners connect with you, and where should they follow you?
Well, if people want to connect, they're very easy to go to Old Mutual's website. There's a section on Old Mutual's website that says else on the economy, where they can see my regular publications, my views on the economy, whether that's short-term issues or longer-term trends, where they can see the podcasts that I've recorded with well-known South Africans, whether those are political analysts or business leaders or economists, and their views on the SA economy and their views on politics and their views on the future of South Africa. So yeah, there's that section on the website. People can contact me directly through Old Mutual. I've got a WhatsApp voice note channel that I send regular issues of interest onto. For instance, last week around the budget time, when I was in the budget lockup and I didn't know when I was going to come out of that lockup, I sent, when we were released from the lockup, I sent a couple of voice notes out to people. And I share my thinking in that way through my weekly emails, through my regular voice notes, and it's on Old Mutual's website, available for anybody.
Thank you. And last but not least, Johann, what is your message to the millions of learners out there who just finished school, who are looking to start a career? What are maybe one or two success principles that they should keep in mind?
I think the most important thing is to find the job that you love. I think that's the most important part. It might not be the best paying job, but if you're passionate about what you do, you're not going to regret that. And I think I don't want to delve in other issues. I think I want to leave people with that thought. It's not always easy. I was very lucky that I found from a very early stage, and that I'm still very happy in the same job that I've been doing for 35 plus 40 years. I'm very lucky. So I think don't go for the high-paying jobs, unless, of course, that's your passion. Go for something that you're passionate about. Don't be scared to change careers. Find the job that makes you happy.
Thank you. Thank you, Johann, for making time to share your insights and your wisdom into the future of leadership, and for sharing your leadership journey and your advice for future leaders.
Thanks very much for inviting me.